See Ted up there? I think he's on his way in. Still a lot of delegates out in the hallway.
Okay.
Well, I don't know where he is. You want to see if he's out there? Take a look at it going. There he comes. Okay. That's what they had in Jungle Nice Water here close. Yeah. We came prepared to go. Started to feel left up. Keep your spot there. I'll move down again shortly.
Okay.
Kind of crowded up here.
It is. Okay, we're going to get going now. If you could take your seats, please. Sorry for the bit of the delay, but we're now all organized for the second session, public session. This morning, we're going to hear a staff report from Alan Hicks around the management strategy evaluation to give us an update on that. And then that will be followed by the MSAB report. And then we have, I think it's 13 regulatory proposals for 2017 that we'll hear from Commission staff make a presentation to provide information to us on each of those regulatory proposals. And then there will be time for public comment and questions. So there is a sign-up sheet again at the back if you would like to have a question for any of the presentations that you hear this morning or any of the regulatory proposals. Please put your name down. Be helpful if you identify which topic you wanted to address. And then come up to the microphone here up towards the front of the room and identify yourself and tell us what you want to ask. So Jim, anything that you wanted to comments for starting today's session?
I have none.
No? So with that, then over to you, Alan.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And good morning, everybody. My name's Alan Hicks. I'm a new face here at IPHC. I started in April last year, and so this is my very first annual meeting. And I'm excited to meet everyone. There are a lot of people for me to meet, but feel free to come up and introduce yourself, ask me questions, and we can have a chat. I'm more than happy to talk to all of you. Today, I'm going to give you an update on the management strategy evaluation. This is an extension of work that Dr. Steve Martell had been doing at IPHC. And there is an associated document with this presentation, and it's document 09 linked on our IPHC website. Let me see if I get this going. There we go. So when I arrived in April last year, the first thing that I did was put together a work plan, and I worked with the Management Strategy Advisory Board to put together this work plan, and this is basically a map of what I will be doing in the next couple of years. I won't go into the details of this Gantt chart that I'm showing up here, except that I have some tasks. I have a timeline in which these tasks will be investigated and completed. It's a flexible plan. It's not written in stone, I hope. But there's a lot of work for me to do over the next few years. I started a few things. As you can see, in 2016, there's a few things that we've already addressed, including me learning a lot about halibut and the fisheries. But today I want to present just a couple parts of this work plan to you and some of the progress that we've made. And that basically is an investigation of our current harvest policy. I'll explain what that is in a moment. A presentation of a possible improved harvest policy. And then a little bit of update on the Management Strategy Evaluation, or MSE, progress, and some future work that I will be doing. So getting right into it, what is our current harvest policy? And this is, as you saw yesterday, Ian presented the blue line. The harvest policy is what defines the catch described by that blue line. It's how Ian gets to the blue line, in other words. It's this procedure that gets you to those catch levels by each regulatory area. It's been designed over the past few decades. There's been some changes made to it over the past few decades, but it was basically designed to meet 5 different goals. That being avoiding very low stock sizes, where a low stock size would be defined as 20% of unfished equilibrium spawning biomass. So that's a really bad place to go. We want to avoid that. It mostly wants to avoid somewhat low stock sizes, and that would be defined as 30% of unfished equilibrium biomass. And that, as Ian mentioned yesterday, is the point where harvest rates start being reduced and we start taking action. To achieve most of the maximum sustainable yield, there's definitely variability in the population, so we can't achieve it in every year, but we want to achieve it as much as we can. We want to reduce the variability in catch as much as we can. And number 5 is what we talked a little bit about yesterday as well, is distribute removals in proportion to the current stock biomass. And so this was this apportionment concept of understanding the distribution of the stock and applying harvest rates to that distribution. And this is to preserve biocomplexity. There's a lot we don't understand about the halibut fishery, so we want to maintain that biocomplexity amongst different regulatory areas. So this is my little graphic of the current harvest policy. What I did when I arrived was really dig deep into the literature, all the IPHC documents, and try to understand what is this current harvest policy and where did it come from. And this is the graphic that I thought would describe it best. So on the left, we have black and gray circles, and that describes science. And those are science basically inputs. What we have is a coast-wide assessment Ian presented yesterday. And then that determines what's called an exploitable biomass. And I'll try to explain what exploitable biomass is in a moment. From that exploitable biomass, we have another science input, what I've labeled apportionment here, but was described as stock distribution yesterday. And that's the stock distribution determined from the survey, so it's a science input. And it basically divides that exploitable biomass among the different regulatory areas. And those are those small gray circles. That is where the management decisions come in, indicated here by the blue hexagon. And management can be, that's the decisions, the management procedure. Right now, the current harvest policy that decides on the blue line are specific harvest rates that differ by regulatory areas. I'll explain that again in a moment. And what that does is apply to the exploitable biomass to determine the actual catch, or the TCEY, in each regulatory area. So that's where management comes in, and then the output is simply catch by regulatory area, which can be summed to get a coast-wide catch, or a TCEY, across the entire, all regulatory areas. So Ian presented yesterday this concept of scale, or the fishing intensity on the coast-wide stock of halibut, And the distribution, how we're distributing the catches amongst the different regulatory areas. You can think of scale in this current harvest policy as the combination of exploitable biomass and the harvest rate that's being applied to that exploitable biomass. So that's the scale, the fishing intensity. And then you can think of distribution as the combination of apportionment and the relative harvest rates among each of those regulatory areas, how much you're going to harvest in each area. The issue that I found with this is it's not easy to determine what the fishing intensity on the coastwide stock is. The first thing we should be thinking about is the halibut stock. We want to manage the halibut stock, and then we want to distribute that management across the different regulatory areas. But with this current harvest policy, it's difficult to determine what the fishing intensity on the coastwide stock is. And that's because scale and distribution are not independent here. They're confounded in a way. We'll try to explain that a little bit more as well. So exactly what is scale of exploitation in our current harvest policy? That was, again, the combination of exploitable biomass and the area-specific harvest rates. Exploitable biomass. This is a concept that uses a selectivity or a proportion caught at age, you can think of it something like that was externally derived and is an input to the stock assessment. So it doesn't specifically come from the stock assessment that Ian's doing. And to be honest, it's not currently representative of the coastwide stock assessment. So in other words, it's a little bit out of date. The harvest rates are area-specific harvest rates. So in the western areas, there's a lower harvest rate of about 16%. And in the eastern areas, a higher harvest rate, about 21%. This is based on past analysis of more productivity in these eastern areas and a little bit more uncertainty in the western areas. And just to note, as I said, we want to avoid very low and somewhat low stock sizes. So when the stock is predicted to be less than 30% of its unfished equilibrium spawning size, then there's a control rule that actually will reduce these harvest rates to protect the stock. So that's the scale. And then how does distribution come into this? It's a combination, as I said earlier, of apportionment or stock distribution and the relative harvest rate. So harvest rates come back into this equation here. Apportionment or stock distribution, which I really like the term stock distribution, is distributing that exploitable biomass or eBio across the regulatory areas. And that's determined by using the set line survey and the 032 weight per unit effort, as was described yesterday by Ian and a little bit by Ray. Once we distribute that biomass into those areas, that exploitable biomass, we simply apply a harvest rate, and those have different, higher in the east, lower in the west, and that determines how much catch is going to be coming out of each regulatory area according to the blue line, right? So that's a quick summary of our current harvest policy. I don't want to go too much in depth with that. If you want some more information, there is chapter 4.5 in the RAW you can refer to, or the document 09 that I mentioned earlier. But I'd like to identify some problems with this current harvest policy that myself and the Management Strategy Advisory Board have identified. Number one, the past simulations that have developed this harvest policy are based on the core areas of the halibut stock, that being 2B, 2C, and 3A. It doesn't include the entire distribution of the halibut as well as the fisheries across all areas. Number two, as I mentioned earlier, the scale, the fishing intensity, and the distribution, or this catch across the different areas, is confounded. It's not easily separated. And again, here's the graphic of the current harvest policy, and you see it takes a coastwide assessment, splits that amongst areas, determines catch in each area, and then you sum that back up to get a coastwide catch. And so again, what is the fishing intensity on the coastwide stock of halibut? The third problem is that eBio, or this exploitable biomass, is currently inconsistent with the coastwide assessment. It's out of date. The selectivity is out of sync. It doesn't include all sources of removals and even across all fleets. And so in my mind, it doesn't exactly represent the fishing mortality. And getting at removal of all sizes of fish, the mortality of U-26 is not explicitly accounted for in this harvest policy, and Ian mentioned that yesterday. In other words, he presented a catch table, which was the blue line catch table yesterday, and it listed O-26 mortality in terms of non-FCUI and FCUI, and then at the bottom of that table was a few rows indicating U-26 mortality. So for the blue line catch table, the amount of mortality of U-26, under 26-inch fish, could change, and none of the FCUI or TCUI numbers would change. So you might think, well, that's not a problem. We only care about what the fishery is catching. We only care about the O-26. But the problem lies here. One is that the apportionment, the harvest rates, and the eBio are all different concepts acting on different types of fish. Second, if commissioners or stakeholders even wanted to set some target fishing harvest rate on O-26 fish, as indicated by this blue rectangle there, and they had this target in mind, they wanted this to be the harvest rate, translating that to the total fishing intensity on all sizes of fish coast-wide, you would hope that mapped over 1-to-1, right? What may occur if you're not accounting for U-26 mortality is there might be a lot of U-26 mortality. And that could actually result in a total fishing intensity higher than what you actually wanted to target. Or vice versa, there could be a low U-26 mortality, resulting in a lower fishing intensity than you actually wanted to occur on the stock. Where this can be really dangerous is indicated by that red line. And let's say that we all decided to act precautionary for some reason, and we wanted a lower target harvest rate than what's typical. What can happen is there might be more mortality on U-26 than we expected, and our total fishing intensity actually exceeds the target that we wanted. So by not accounting for the U-26 mortality, we don't really know what fishing intensity we're actually applying to the stock. And that can be a problem in the future, is that in 6 to 8 years, we say, where are all the fish? Well, we might have been fishing too hard on U-26, or there might be a lot more than we expected if we weren't fishing as hard as we did expect to. So that's identifying 4 problems with the harvest policy. And you might be wondering, okay, great, but why do we even have a harvest policy? And I think this is a really important question to answer. And what a harvest policy is it's a long-term strategic planning. If you own a business, you want to think about what's my long-term plan for this business, right? Well, we're trying to manage a fishery, and we want to have a long-term plan, and we have some objectives of this fishery in the long term. Those objectives may be we want to preserve the spawning biomass. We want to have fish in the future, for example. Another objective might be we want to have catch of halibut, right? We want to have a catch level that's above some amount so that we can actually have a fishery. Those might be conflicting objectives. To lower the spawning biomass because of higher catches, so we have to balance these different objectives. And a harvest policy is a way that we can have long-term strategic planning to meet those objectives. It also provides a reference point when making decisions on catch levels in an individual year. So we might take a line in the decision table that Ian has presented. Let's say we have a status quo SPR line that he's presented. That can be a reference point in like, okay, that's how we've been behaving over the last 3 years. Maybe that's a good starting point. Let's deviate a little bit from that according to current conditions. Those deviations are called short-term tactical decisions in my mind, and that's why we have an annual assessment. We don't just come up with a harvest policy, put it into place, and let that manage the stock for the next 100 years. No, we have the annual meeting every year. We make decisions based on current conditions, market conditions, fishery conditions, stakeholder observations, things like that, and that can override the long-term strategic planning for more short-term decisions. But we have to to realize that a consistent departure from the harvest policy is going to have consequences, and we may not meet the objectives that we've defined for that harvest policy. Other reasons why we might have a harvest policy are it can be now evaluated against external standards like Marine Stewardship Council certification. They want to see what is your harvest policy. The MSC has certain standards, and we want to evaluate your harvest policy against those standards. And it also provides credibility for the management of Pacific halibut. So again, that business plan or that harvest policy, that long-term strategic planning that we have is very important for not only meeting our objectives, but for other people to understand how we are managing the stock. And then finally, a harvest policy can include harvest agreements between countries, between regulatory areas. And an example of that is we already have that embedded into the current harvest policy of different harvest rates among the different regulatory areas. So that gets me to, what are we going to do now? So I've identified some problems with the current harvest policy. I've heard from a lot of stakeholders that they're not happy with the current harvest policy. So what do we do? Well, we have a Management Strategy Advisory Board. And I've been working closely with this board to develop a management strategy evaluation for Pacific halibut. And this is a process. It's not really a single outcome. It's going to be a process that takes time, over many years, involves stakeholder input, involves commissioner input, involves science, and it will be improved over time as we keep investigating this. But really the goal of management strategy evaluation is to develop robust harvest policies through stakeholder input and evaluate them with simulation modeling. That's all it is. So when working with the MSAB, I said, well, I better understand the history of the management of Pacific halibut. And for us to develop an updated harvest policy, I need to know the history. So I went back and looked, and I saw earlier assessments included age 8 and older halibut. And then they said, oh, the fishery's interacting with age 6 and older halibut. So let's manage on age 6 and older halibut. And then they thought, well, maybe we should manage on 032 halibut. So it included 032. And then in 2011, it says, oh, we should really be thinking about 026 halibut. We can keep going down this road. We can introduce 016, 012, whatever you want. But my proposal is go to 0. Why not manage on 0, all mortality, all sizes of fish? Let's consider it. And we can account for all removals across all fleets, including trawl fleets, longline fleets, anybody interacting with halibut. We can account for all of that mortality. So it's not as easy as that, though. We have to have a metric that measures that mortality. And we have different selectivities across different fleets. They're interacting with different sizes of fish, so it's not a simple concept of just a harvest rate on an exploitable biomass, because every fleet has a different exploitable biomass. But there are concepts, don't worry, people before me have come up with the ideas, and there are metrics out there that can measure and provide a metric for all sizes and all sources of mortality. So my proposal is, first off, let's not mess with the current harvest policy too much, but let's rearrange it and think about it in a different way so that we can begin to evaluate it. So what I have here, the same colors in the legend on the top, where black circles are a science input, blue are where decision points or management decisions are being made, and green are outputs of those management decisions. We have a coast-wide assessment Ian presented yesterday, and that provides an input into what is the scale of fishing, what is the fishing intensity on the coast-wide stock, and that can be an output, the total mortality on the stock. And then we can distribute that total mortality across the regulatory areas, the fleets if necessary, etc. So you might ask, okay, what's the scale? Well, that's what we're calling the coast-wide fishing intensity. What is the fishery effect on the coast-wide stock? An example of this is SPR, or FSPR, which Ian's already been presenting for a number of years. Managers can decide on a coastwide fishing intensity that would then determine a total mortality, and then that total mortality can be distributed across the different regulatory areas through the concepts right now of apportionment or stock distribution and relative harvest rate. So really the only new concept in this figure compared to the current harvest policy before, well, there's a couple new concepts. One is it's rearranged so that you have a total mortality. And number two is the introduction of this coastwide fishing intensity. So I'll let you soak in that picture a little bit. So what is a good measure of this coastwide fishing intensity? What is a metric? Well, one potential metric is this called spawning potential ratio, or SPR. And I'm sure most people in this room have heard of SPR, either through other fisheries they've been involved with, other management processes they've been involved with, or mentioned over time in the halibut fishery. So what is spawning potential ratio? Try to give you a really quick definition of it. If you want to learn more about it, you just come up and ask me, and I can try to explain it more to you. But basically, it's the spawning output per recruit, where a recruit is a single fish, and its spawning output that it has over its lifetime with fishing, compared to the spawning output per recruit without fishing. So fishing might cause that recruit to not live as long of a life as it could have if there was no fishing, right? And that's okay. It's a long-term average concept. So really what it is if we fish at a constant rate, this SPR, it's what would the spawning potential of the stock, how much would the spawning potential of the stock be reduced? So if you think about this, without fishing, SPR would be 100% because the numerator and the denominator would be exactly the same. There'd be no fishing on top, no fishing on the bottom, so it would be 1 or 100%. Once we introduce fishing, that introduces in the long term, applying that consistent harvest rate, that the spawning potential is reduced by some amount. So an SPR of 40% would mean that the spawning potential of the stock was reduced by 60%. And Ian did discuss this yesterday a little bit. This is a measure of coastwide fishing intensity. It accounts for all mortality over all of the fleet. And again, this is one metric out of a possibility of a number of different metrics. I will investigate other metrics, but SPR has certain benefits. And that is, one, it is a single measure of fishing intensity on all sizes and sources, right? Two, it relates to spawning potential. Spawners, spawning fish out there is something that we do want to protect because that creates fish for future generations. It is commonly used around the world. It's used by the Pacific Fishery Management Council. It's used by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So it's not a new concept, and it's already been used and researched extensively. In fact, Dr. Bill Clark wrote a paper on SPR in the early 90s that the North Pacific Council has actually based some of their management on. So this rearranged proposed new harvest policy is what has been called the SPR-based harvest policy. And that's indicating that it would really use SPR as a metric. I will investigate other metrics, as I mentioned. But what are the benefits of this SPR-based harvest policy? Accounting for mortality of all sources. You see, I've been saying that a lot today. That's really important. It separates the scale and distribution. Commissioners can actually make decisions on now, I have this level of coastwide effect on the stock, fishing intensity, and then I want to distribute it this way. They can actually separate that decision-making process. For me, it allows for a much more straightforward and clear evaluation and a management strategy evaluation. That's a bonus for me. And some of you might be familiar with the fisheries footprint concept that Dr. Martel introduced a year or two ago. And this really is the first step to beginning to investigate fishery footprint, because that is based on SPR. So there are a number of benefits to moving to this approach. And how do we map over to that approach for this year, this actual meeting? Well, it's already been done. Ian's been smart enough. He's been introducing this to you for a number of years. I'm really just a messenger here. And in the decision table that he has presented, you see there's a column called fishing intensity. And that basically is FSPR. The little subscript there is the SPR. So if you think about it, with no removals, as I said, SPR would be 100%. And so that's where F100% comes from in this table. And if we look down, we see that the status quo SPR is basically F46%, which is determined by the average SPR applied by the decisions made over the last 3 years is 46%. And so that's where that line comes from. And it's basically the application of this SPR-based harvest policy. So looking into the future, the status quo SPR is a stepping stone to mapping to a new harvest policy. It's really a short-term tactical decision. It's consistent with what we've been doing in recent years. However, we're not certain that it's going to meet the objectives of the stakeholders and the managers, the objectives of this fishery. So the proposal is, well, we have this short-term decision-making, the status quo SPR, but in the future, we would want to evaluate this with management strategy evaluation to find the proper FSPR, SPR value that meets the objectives, the long-term strategic thinking. And that's my goal over the next few years. What is management strategy evaluation? Well, hopefully next year, I'm going to present you a table like this, but actually filled in with numbers for everybody here to make decisions about. And what this looks like is across the columns in blue is what we're calling management procedure. And that's basically different levels of SPR, where you have high effort resulting in low SPR, followed or a low effort, which results in a high FS or SPR, right? Remember, no effort is 100% SPR. And then down the rows, showed here in gray, are objectives and performance metrics related to those objectives. And that would be, you might have a conservation objective where you want to keep the spawning biomass above some value. And then I can enter in a probability that the spawning biomass would be above that objective given that harvest rate or that fishing intensity. Or you might have a yield objective. You want to have the catch above some value, and I can present that as a probability in the table as well. And then you can begin to look down the column, each column, and evaluate the trade-off. How much risk are you willing to accept? When developing a management strategy evaluation, we have to think about what we can control, which are called management procedures, which we can control the fishing intensity on the stock by defining a coast-wide catch level, right? Versus what we cannot control or choose not to control, which would be defined as a scenario. And the goal of management strategy evaluation is to choose management procedures like an FSPR that are robust to a multitude of scenarios, things that we don't know about, migration of halibut, recruitment of halibut. We want it to be robust to that. And then find a management procedure that's robust to that, that meets our objectives. But the question we had in the MSAV is, what about bycatch? What do we do with bycatch? Is that something we want to try and control, or something we want to treat as a scenario? And as a quick example, I want to use abundance-based management of PSC limits in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, something that the North Pacific Council has been working on. A little bit of background on this. The PSC limit of Pacific halibut is currently a fixed limit determined by the North Pacific Council. As halibut abundance declines, that PSC limit becomes a larger proportion of the total mortality. More of the catch is going to the PSC limit. As halibut abundance increases, that PSC limit may be limiting or constraining on groundfish fisheries up in the Bering Sea. So the North Pacific Council has developed a working group working on this problem to maybe come up with a better solution. But how does that relate to what I'm talking about in the management strategy evaluation? Well, one, the models that I'm developing could potentially help to evaluate ABM or abundance-based management of PSC limits. More related to us and why we're here this week is that the MSAB, which is what I call it now, that's the new name in case you're wondering, is focused on the directed fishery. We're really trying to focus on the directed halibut fishery. So our plan right now is to treat bycatch as a scenario, and basically that means develop harvest policies that are robust to a range of various bycatch scenarios. In other words, we're not going to treat bycatch as something that we control right now and make decisions on, but we're going to treat it as something that we're not controlling. So to summarize this talk in 3 points, basically the current harvest policy needs updating. An SPR-based harvest policy was presented, and status quo SPR is a row in the decision table that could be an interim short-term mapping over to this new harvest policy. In the future, management strategy evaluation will be used to evaluate alternative SPR values that will meet the long-term objectives that are defined by stakeholders as well as commissioners. And those management procedures or SPR values would be robust to possible bycatch scenarios. So thank you very much, and I think I'll turn it over to the MSAB co-chairs, and then we'll have some time for questions.
All right. Morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Alan, for getting us started. This morning, Alan has showed us some of the technical work that staff have accomplished with respect to management strategy evaluation over the past couple of years, but the past year in particular. Michelle and myself, Adam, as the co-chairs of the advisory process for the MSAB, are going to provide a brief update on some of our activities over the past year. So the MSAB normally meets twice a year. This year we met in the spring and the fall. And we talked about a range of topics that are probably familiar to most folks in the audience here. Over the past, I guess, year and a half or so, we've had a number of governance changes as to how the advisory board operates, with Alan's starting with the commission. A work plan was developed, and that took a fair bit of our time in the spring. We then spent, I guess, probably a good portion of our spring meeting and the majority of our fall meeting getting into some of the nitty-gritty with respect to management strategy evaluation, talking about our goals and objectives, how those relate to some of the modeling approaches that staff will use to help advance the MSC process. And then we also dealt with a few specific tasks that were given to the MSAB by the commissioners at the annual meeting last year, specifically an evaluation of the current harvest policy.
So relative to the governance of the Management Strategy Advisory Board, Adam and I were here at the annual meeting in 2016, and at that time we reported some changes in our governance, which included the election of co-chairs and the use of a contracted outside facilitator to help us facilitate our meetings, take meeting notes, and draft up our recommendations for commission consideration. And we also began drafting terms of reference, or it's similar to a charter document for the MSAB that describes our membership, our decision-making process, and our administrative process that we'll go through to govern ourselves, if you will. So we just completed that terms of reference, and we provided that to commission staff and to the commissioners. And staff, I understand that Dave Wilson will be proposing changes to the broader IPHC rules of procedure, to which the MSAB terms of reference are appended. That will come up, I believe, under agenda item 10, and it's referred to as report number 16 in the briefing material. So relative to the work plan, Alan just shared with you kind of in detail his Gantt chart of what he's looking ahead for the next 2 years for the work plan. That is also what drives the MSAB discussions and the tasks that we'll be hoping to accomplish over the next 2 years. On the goals and objectives, so in 2014, when the MSAB was first formed, we developed 5 draft fishery goals. They're relatively broad in nature, and they include biological sustainability of the stock, sustainability and stability of all directed fisheries, minimizing fishery closures, so ensuring that there's a continued access to the resource by users, minimize bycatch and bycatch mortality, and serve consumer needs. And from that, we developed some measurable outcomes, an initial set of measurable outcomes that we wanted to have modeled through the MSE process. And those measurable outcomes were items that could be monitored and measured. They were identified at a level of specificity in terms of the amount we wanted to achieve over time and what that timeline was in which we wanted to achieve it. But we were not quite sure whether we've got those specified correctly, so the amounts and the timelines. And so we had a discussion at our May meeting and at our October meeting to what is the underlying intent of those goals and objectives. What is it that we are really wanting to achieve? And had a really good discussion. We documented those and provided them to the Commission as well. And so given where we are on our model development and the overview you just received from Alan, we're having a more intensive discussion to revisit those objectives and make sure we have some refined measurable outcomes that are useful to Alan and his modeling process. So on the scenarios and management procedures, you just received a good description of this also from Alan, and we do plan to talk a little bit more about this in terms of our review of the current harvest policy and what our recommendations are for moving forward.
All right, so as folks have heard a number of times, the management strategy evaluation requires stakeholders to define what their objectives are, and then we're going to develop a suite of management procedures, ways to harvest fish. We evaluate those procedures against the objectives to see which procedure is going to perform best. So we've been going through this iterative process for a year and a bit. We really got into it, and that's the bulk of the work that Alan has shared with you and Michelle just summarized. Another item that was tasked to the MSAB at the annual meeting last year was a specific component of the management procedure, and that was to review the current harvest policy. I think the thinking was let's evaluate where we are right now before we try developing new management procedures and new ways of doing business. So the summary that Alan provided was far more technical. We'll try to give some of the high-level bullet points, and Alan can correct us where we strayed. So management obviously has evolved considerably over a number of years, and it's evolved in response to the complications with multiple jurisdictions, conflicting objectives, and also ecological interactions, different uses of the resource. What it's come down to is that the scaling of the current harvest policy revolves around the estimate of e-bio, and Alan spent a fair bit of time talking about the challenges of using e-bio in this the scaling of the harvest policy. So here's the summary. E-bio, I think as most people here could probably relate, is not well understood. Not well understood by stakeholders. It's changed a number of times in response to changing management over the years. And the point in particular that stood out during our fall meeting that Alan presented to us was It relies on selectivity curves that are not, that they're outdated. They're not representative of the assessment results. The current harvest policy is outdated. So at the end of the day, we came to an agreement in determining that all sources of mortality with the current harvest policy are not accounted for, particularly mortality of U26 or under 26-inch fish, that they're not accounted for. There could be changes in overall fishing intensity that don't actually match what we are targeting when the commissioners make their decisions. So as an advisory board, the MSAB's task is to provide advice to the commission. And our advice to the commission's tasking from the last annual meeting was that we found the current harvest policy to be unresponsive, that we recommend an alternative harvest policy approach be addressed to account for these shortcomings. Spawning potential ratio is one approach. A spawning potential ratio based harvest policy is one way that, or one item that we should be evaluating through a management strategy evaluation. It's not to say that it is the answer, but we think it offers a clear way forward to make some concrete progress over the next 1 to 2 years. All right, so that was our task. Sorry. This was one of our main tasks from our last meeting. A couple of more housekeeping items that Michelle and I wanted to bring up was from the interim meeting. We wanted to just seek affirmation from the Commission on some of the notional guidance that we received at the interim meeting, in particular with respect to the interim meeting report. So Section 6.2 of the interim meeting report had 3 items. These 3 items is what we anticipate developing our meeting agendas on over the next 2 meetings, so we want to make sure we've got it right. The first was that the Commission noted that the Commission noted the presentation that was provided on the harvest policy, and the Commission agreed that the current harvest policy approaches to address these shortcomings should it take account for all sizes and sources of mortality. So essentially, providing some endorsement that we start to explore the work that's been presented today. In addition to the work on management procedures, there was also a brief discussion at the interim meeting about goals and objectives. At the interim meeting, I think Michelle shared some of the goals and objectives that we had developed and drafted a number of years ago. And a couple of commissioners pointed out that these need to be shared more clearly with commissioners, that commissioners want to help develop and approve these objectives. And in particular, we should have objectives that are not just satisfied with the status quo, that we should look at growing the stock or increasing the stock size such that higher yields, like what we've realized over the recent years, can be maintained rather than just maintaining a stable stock. So to this end, we have a number of next steps that we've proposed for our meeting in the spring and fall of 2017.
Yes, so here at this annual meeting, we're seeking approval from the Commission on evaluating the coast-wide fishing intensity-based approach, of which would be SPR as one alternative harvest policy approach. Receive confirmation of the MSAB's intent to evaluate alternative coast-wide fishing intensities through the MSC process in 2017. It would be our intent, if we receive that approval, to make a recommendation at the 2018 annual meeting about an appropriate fishing intensity that meets the goals and objectives as developed and proposed by the MSAB. And then in 2018 and beyond, once a suitable MSC model to evaluate area-specific objectives is available, then the MSAB could begin to evaluate the parts of the harvest policy that relate to those specific areas. So our next meeting is scheduled for sometime the week of May 8th of this year. Our preliminary list of agenda topics are to receive an update from Alan on the multiple area model development, that area-specific model, to discuss and refine those goals and objectives and identify those measurable outcomes and performance metrics. So again, what are the things that can be monitored and measured that we think right now our best guess would be that those would accomplish the goals and objectives. Once we go through the evaluation, we'll see whether or not those amounts and timelines would need to be adjusted in order to achieve those intended outcomes. So that will be something that MSAB develops and works with Alan to make sure that those are appropriate for his model. We'll also develop scenarios, including the abundance-based management scenario that Alan just referred to in his presentation, and evaluate an alternative harvest policy such as the SPR-based approach, with the intent of coming back to the Commission with potential alternative harvest policy approaches to be used in 2018. On the governance side, I guess I also wanted to mention that Adam and I solicited interest from current MSAB members to see who would be interested in continuing on the MSAB. We've had a few of our members miss some of the meetings. We want to confirm whether or not they intend to continue, or if we would have some potential vacancies that we may want to solicit nominations for. We'll also need to talk through our process for membership appointments, and so that is not clearly laid out right now in our terms of reference or the rules of procedure, so we want to make sure we have that process nailed down. And we'll be working with Dave between now and the May meeting to talk about future facilitation for the MSAB and how that would work.
Right. So that's everything that we have for our portion of the advisory process. I suppose now I'll turn it back to Chair and see if we have any questions on our portion and Alan's.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. Just see if the commissioners have any questions for any of you three. Linda.
Thank you for that great report from all of you. I feel like this is some of the most important work that the Commission is doing right now to try to develop a new harvest policy that really has broad support from stakeholders. So really appreciate the work that you're doing. I wondered if you could comment on how you see apportionment fitting into the work that you're doing and the work both that Alan's doing and the committee as one question, and then also to see if you could also comment on whether there's an opportunity to move this process a little bit more quickly than the schedule you're on right now. Additional resources, additional meetings if they're possible, and if there's a way to accelerate the process a bit that you see.
Thanks, Linda, for that. I can try to tackle that question. As Michelle explained, we would like to first sort of pin down the coast-wide fishing intensity, focus on that aspect of this proposed SBR-based harvest policy. That is not an easy task, but a more simple task than the area-specific distribution of catches. So that is something that will take a little bit of time. And then once we have that sort of pinned down, we'd like to begin to focus on area-specific issues like related to apportionment, where apportionment seems to be taken on a new definition here, or a new definition than I had interpreted as. So I guess my first task would be to define apportionment, what apportionment really is, define stock distribution, and how that relates to harvest rates amongst the areas. Once we have that definition, we can begin to have a discussion with stakeholders, and in the meantime, I would have to be doing a lot of coding and work behind the scenes to develop the model that could then evaluate sort of area-specific decision-making processes like apportionment. And that relates to the schedule that you mentioned, is MSE process takes time. It's a process, not an output. An assessment takes time, but Ian works really hard to make that an annual product. MSE really is not an annual product, but it's a evolving process where we have stages in which we can provide advice to the commissioners in coming up with a robust harvest policy. And so we want to focus first on the coastwide fishing intensity, bring in apportionment, and that's going to take some time. I don't know that it can be accelerated any more than the work plan that I've presented. And in fact, you might have noticed the work plan, the very last task in there is developing further operating models, which relates to spatial operating models or area-specific operating models. And that's actually scheduled on my work plan to go beyond 2018. And because that takes time to do that. And so the work plan was a reasonable work plan that I presented, and like I said, it's flexible, but I don't know how much it can be short.
Any other questions from the commissioners? I have a couple along the same lines that Linda was asking, Alan. So I appreciate what you're saying about your first focus of priority is around the coastwide, and what I'm hearing is, you know, exploring metrics, well, using the metrics of SPR to come up with what you think would be an appropriate level of fishing intensity is kind of the first order priority. And I think that makes good sense, but I'm wondering if these things have to happen sequentially if one had additional resources. So meaning that that's coastwide is fine, but clearly there are issues within areas that we would like to look at as well. And so rather than doing this sequentially, can it be done concurrently? If you had additional resources, and that's really the question Linda and I are asking.
I think it could be done concurrently with additional resources. My main concern is that what I really like about the MSAB is it's a stakeholder-driven process. And I want to make sure that all of the stakeholders have the opportunity to feed into that process. And so I could hire 20 programmers and we could probably have a spatial model coded up, you know, in time to do all of the analysis. But what I fear is that I come up here next year with, here's my results, and then somebody comes back to me and says, but you didn't consider my objectives. And so I think in terms of the timing, we also need to consider stakeholder involvement and the process itself evolving as it needs to evolve.
If I could, just add a couple of points to that. So to that end, about it being a stakeholder-driven process, we have, the MSAB itself, the MSAB itself, has made some changes to the meeting structure to try to make better use of our time. Although it's been going on for a couple of years, we only meet for a day and a half or 2 days at a time and only do that twice a year. So all told, it's only been maybe 2 weeks of meetings. So we acknowledged that at our last meeting, I think, and adopted some changes to try to make better use of our time traveling down there. We also did have a fairly lengthy discussion, I think at the meeting before last, with respect to a coast-wide model versus an area-based model. I think all members of the MSAB acknowledged that the objectives that they were putting forward were largely regulatory area specific. So at the very end of the day, we're going to need something that's area specific. But we also acknowledge that's going to take a long time, and we wanted to be able to maintain a momentum to demonstrate some progress over the short term. And we realize that we can still answer some important questions with the coast-wide model. And so I think the advice that came out of last year's summary was that we continue with the coast-wide model to answer some of the questions we can, like, for example, with respect to bycatch and consequences of bycatch when it's treated as different scenarios in the operating model. And use it as a learning experience so that folks who participate in the MSAB can understand how we are evaluating objectives, or evaluating different management procedures against our objectives. And then as we, I guess, get a better understanding, it'll buy some time for staff to get into the area-based model.
Yeah, I think we recognize as commissioners that this is definitely a stakeholder-driven process, and that setting those objectives are critical to the work that you undertake in MSAP. But I mean, this has also been, I would say, a process for a number of years now, and that's why we're kind of pressing a little bit on you about the concept of providing additional resources, given that we've really, I would say, over the last 3 or 4 years, I think kind of struggled with a couple of things. One is that the previous harvest policy, for all the reasons that Alan just spoke about, and yourself as well, Adam, is that it is no longer effective, and we need to consider all sources of mortality, and that's why looking at something like fishing intensity under SPR makes good sense. However, if you bring up slide 21, I think to me, what I'm hearing is that, let's say that work is the focus of what you're going to be working on over the next year. And I suspect maybe looking at changes to maybe relative harvest rates as well. But fundamentally within that schematic, I think as well, maybe the question to you then, Alan, is apportionment still going to be calculated the same way that you're doing it today?
That's a great question. And when I heard the comments yesterday, I realized that apportionment and the stock distribution is going to be the issue, and that I'm actually hopeful that people have accepted this coastwide fishing intensity and are already moving on towards thinking about apportionment. And so I did like your description yesterday, Paul, about maybe changing this word apportionment in the black circle to stock distribution. And the survey, Setline survey right now is a scientific way to determine stock distribution. That may not be the only way. Maybe we investigate some other ways. So yes, it can be a part of the MSE. We can investigate alternative scientific ways to determine stock distribution. But really the management procedure here is the harvest rates, the relative harvest rates between areas, and considering that when making management decisions. But you are correct, MSE is also a really useful tool to investigate the scientific inputs and how that affects the outcomes of management.
Thanks very much, Alan. I'll just see if there's any other questions from commissioners. No, not seeing any. Steve, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you. We have a couple of questions from the online audience I can introduce now.
Yeah, let's do that. And do we have questions in the room as well?
We do have questions in the room, and I'll ask our staff to bring up the list of anybody who's signed up. So for the online questions, the first one is from Steve Martell. A question for Alan. He also has a question left over from yesterday, which we can ask after that, which is related to today's discussion. So this one is question for Alan. The existing harvest policy and apportionment scheme is based on the assumption that the survey queue is the same in all regions. Does your proposal make the same assumption? Also, are there data that can be used to test this assumption?
Thanks, Dr. Martell. If I would have known, I could have asked you that question last year, I suppose. But to answer your question, yes, as I mentioned to Paul, that is something that could be investigated within the MSE concept, is what if the survey queue or catchability differs amongst the regulatory areas when determining stock distribution. We can either define a harvest policy that is robust to that scenario of there being different queues, and we're not accounting for that in our apportionment scheme. Or we can try to find data that would help us determine the different catchabilities and possibly a different way to distribute the stock when defining the area-specific catch limits. I think the first step for us would be to think of that as a scenario, because offhand, standing up here in front of all you, I'm not exactly sure what data are available to help us determine the different catchabilities amongst the regulatory areas. So as an MSC analyst, I would develop a scenario in what I call an operating model that would have potentially different catchability amongst different regulatory areas, but our apportionment scheme is as it stands, and we're assuming same catchability and defining or finding a harvest policy robust to that scenario and potential misspecifications there.
Okay, thank you. Then the question from yesterday, which is related to that, is a question of Ian. That if you calculated the annual surplus production in each area, you could ensure that the area-based apportionment and harvest policies are consistent with the annual surplus production. And Dr. Martel points out that this was the point that Doug Maven was making.
Yeah, thanks again, Steve. And that's a great idea, and it's one that maybe we can consider. There's obviously going to be issues with that as well. But as I mentioned, we don't, in the MSC process, we don't need to have this as slide 21 that's being shown on the screen right now as the only thing that we're evaluating. We can evaluate alternative harvest policies, and that harvest policy may be one based on surplus production in the areas. That would be something that I would personally need to think about a bit more, but if people are interested, and this is a stakeholder-driven process, we might be able to bring that into the MSC process and actually investigate that, evaluate it against alternative management procedures and harvest policies like slide 21, and find the one that works best to meet our objectives.
Thank you. The other question online is from Malcolm Milne, who asks if we could please look at slide 15 from the update of the MSC presentation. I appreciate this work and fully support moving to an SPR-based policy. My concern is setting the scale. Given that, excuse me, given that the IPHC has adopted catch limits above the blue line or current harvest policy, doesn't adopting the status quo SPR indicate an immediate departure from the current harvest policy? Please also see slide 25.
Yes, you're exactly right. It is a departure from the current harvest policy. The current harvest policy defines the catches described by the blue line, and the status quo SPR is a higher catch than that defined by the blue line. So it is a departure from the harvest policy, but we're also realizing that at least in the last 3 years, the status quo SPR has seen a stock that has been stable or slowly increasing, and so empirically, that's a harvest policy that's working in the short term. And so that is something that maybe we can use this year in deciding on the catch limits, but it's not something I want to put into place for long-term strategic planning, because that may be working now, but it may not be working in 5 years. And I really appreciated the comment yesterday somebody made where the fishery is different now than it was even 2 years ago. And that's why we have short-term decision making.
Is that it for questions online, Steve?
That was all the questions online, and then we have a series from the room.
Got a series in the room? Okay. Just before we go to in the room, Jim, you had a question?
Well, it was less than a question, and I'm not sure this comment will be all that useful, but we keep referring to the current harvest policy. And of course, we may have a old harvest policy that has not been replaced, but neither has it been followed for several years. So when this person asks, shouldn't we have an immediate departure from the current harvest policy? Well, we departed from that harvest policy in 2005, so it'll be a continued departure from the harvest policy. And I don't find that as a terrible thing. As you said, the fisheries has changed, circumstances have changed, our understandings of the stock has changed. So we have still calculated the blue line as a benchmark, and it has all those errors with it, or problems with it. It's not an error. It's the way it's calculated gives that number. It's a benchmark, and it gives us some information. We haven't used that very, as it was intended to be used in the harvest policy that was developed maybe a dozen years ago. So I think the harvest policy is evolving, has been evolving, and it'd be really good if we could come to an agreement with a set of rules that are a more tight harvest policy that everyone agreed to. That's a laudable goal, so let's keep working towards that.
I would be prepared to never mention the blue line again. So that would be my recommendation. I think it's a tool that has outlived its usefulness, and we have some really good work underway that's going to replace it. We've already made decisions that don't consider it, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do. I think there are more questions though in the room, and certainly would like to hear from the audience. I have a question.
And then questions from the room. First up is Jerry Christensen.
I'd like to get on my favorite topic here, bycatch. And bycatch in Alaska, as I understand it, doesn't count the U-32. So if you don't count part of the input, how can you trust that bycatch? And the bycatch is, well, I'm told it's gone down, but it's gone down because it's been shut down on account of salmon. So I don't think you can do any of this SPR stuff unless somehow you get the bycatch under control. And in 1987, this is ancient history, but I feel it has to be, we've got a new kid on the block here, so I have to mention this. In 1987, we refused to sign the treaty. And we had meetings in Anchorage, Seattle, and back and forth and back and forth. And we finally signed it, I believe, in late July or August. And the U.S. was going to get their bycatch under control. Here we are. I don't know how many years, I never figured out the amount of years, but that was a long time ago, and there isn't a hell of a lot's happened since. So, and I don't think you can go ahead with your SPR, and it looks like it could be good, but without that component of it, I don't think it's going anywhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I'm going to let Alan respond to what Gary was asking about SPR, because I think it does take into account, at least partially, what Gary was concerned about. Did you have a question?
Thanks, Gary. Is it Gary or Jerry? Gary, okay. Thanks, Gary. It was nice to meet you. And you're exactly right. Bycatch is a concern. It should be something that we do investigate. However, in this MSE process, as I mentioned, we're trying to just treat that as a scenario, as something that we're not trying to control right now, but we do need to understand the potential range of bycatch, the potential amount of bycatch out there. So using the data that we have and maybe improving the data collection to get a better idea of what bycatch is out there is going to be very useful for us to consider in the MSE. And just hopefully it'll put your mind at ease a little bit, is the MSAB has been very concerned about bycatch, and we spent a large proportion of our meeting discussing how we're going to treat bycatch when investigating this SPR-based harvest policy. So hopefully we come up with a method that meets your criteria and is a very useful outcome for everybody. But thanks for that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Jerry, he's Gary. So.
Right.
Jerry Christensen, Chair of the Sport Fishing Advisory Board in British Columbia. My question is related to the issue that question this time related to the issue I raised yesterday, and that is my desire, at least, to distinguish between the notion of apportionment as it's presently defined and the instead designating, dealing with the issue of stock distribution and various models that relate to that. And in that context, I wanted to ask where migration fits into this, because clearly part of the difficulty with the notion of apportionment, as I understand it, is of course you're taking the current the current survey, which determined where fish were at a particular point in time. And then you're saying, because of that, we're going to then divide up in the following way, which seems to assume that where that stock is the proper metric for that division and distribution. And so I wondered where particularly in your slide 21, how you see migration and what we understand about migration fitting into that process, so that we're confident that when a harvest rate for an area is set, it is taken into account an accurate understanding of what the biomass may be in that area at that time.
Thanks, Jerry. And I believe it was you yesterday that was talking about stock distribution, and you really had a really nice comment that apportionment is not only stock distribution, that the definition of apportionment is larger than that. So I appreciate that. And related to your question, migration is a big concern of ours. And in fact, if there was no migration, we could just go back to the old days of when they had regulatory area specific assessments and everything was a closed system within each regulatory area. But we moved to that coast-wide assessment because we believe there is migration between the regulatory areas. And that is something that we do have to consider in this evaluation, in this management strategy evaluation. The difficulty is we don't have a really good understanding of what migration is. We're doing a lot of research to get better data. We're doing a lot of research to understand it better. But there's still a lot of uncertainty with it. So this is part of the reason that investigating apportionment isn't something that I can just go away and report back in a month on. Because there's a lot of intricacies in exactly how the stock behaves, exactly how the stock works, and how that relates to apportioning or allocating catch amongst the regulatory areas, and how the decisions we make affects that distribution of the stock. So my task now is to go away, work with Ian and Ray and others on IPHC staff, understand as much as we can about migration, and code up some operating models that consider different hypotheses about migration of Pacific halibut, and then use those operating models to develop harvest policies that are robust to what we do know about migration and incorporating the uncertainties that we have about migration. And so that's why it's going to take a little bit of time, because that's not an easy task. It's going to take time for me to understand this, to code the models, and then to actually run the models, bring it back to the MSAB, make sure stakeholders are informed, and then present it back here at an annual meeting. So thank you for bringing that up. That is another issue that we'll have to consider, and along with bycatch, it's a very important topic that the MSAB is keeping track of.
Well, thank you very much for that. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to raise one other what I think is related issue, given that I actually put my name on the speakers list to speak to a later issue, which is the question of the of nursery areas. But it does seem to me that that issue also fits into this. I mean, there is a proposal from staff, as I understand it, to eliminate nursery areas because we can't keep everybody else out of them, so we might as well go in with long lines and fish as well. But it does seem to me that and in the staff report it says we could find no scientific evidence that there are nursery areas. Well, it seems to me that it would be premature to move toward an assumption that areas where large numbers of small fish congregate somehow shouldn't be taken into account both in determining harvest policy and exerting the IPHC's ability to prevent all fishing in those areas until we understand how that fits into the distribution of stock in order to decide where fishing can in fact take place by all harvesters. But anyway, I registered the point rather than having to come back to the mic again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Jerry. Steve, we'll move on to the next speaker. Next question. Yes, the next question is from Kathy Hansen.
Kathy Hansen, Southeast Alaska Fishermen's Alliance. And if I manage to get this spit out correctly, there should be 2 questions and a comment in here. So this is all really comes down to the stock distribution and apportionment. So the first question is kind of, right now we're using just the set line survey to kind of figure out the stock distribution. It seems to me that since the set line survey is only really a 2-week look at the fishery, that if we could incorporate some of the weight per unit effort of the commercial fishery, where you're getting a glimpse of what's occurring across the different areas over the whole year on some kind of weighted scale, that it might actually help incorporate and bring forward more of the effects that the different areas are seeing. And I don't know if that's true or not. So that's kind of one question. The second one is, I didn't really hear it mentioned last night, but I believe, or yesterday, but I believe that the geographical area size is part of the assessment and stock distribution. And I guess I'd kind of like to get that confirmed or not, and if so, a little more description of how that works on the process.
All right, thanks, Kathy. I'm going to turn to Alan to address that.
Hi, Kathy. Related to the WPUE from the fishery being used in apportionment, potentially yes, that could be done somehow. I'm not certain exactly how right now. I think Dr. Ray Webster has really made a lot of advances this last year in understanding and presenting the uncertainties associated with apportionment or the stock distribution. I think that's a great first step to understanding what is stock distribution to us and what should we be accounting for when we're using that. And potentially maybe fishery WPUE would add more uncertainty to that. In fact, it probably would, but it might be the right uncertainty to add to that, and it might give us some insight into how the stock distribution changes over the fishery season, and then the challenging part comes in how do you use that in management. So that's a great idea, and we'll definitely keep that written down. Your second comment was related to geographical area and how that's used in apportionment. As I understand it, Ray, in his survey analysis, is using the bottom area of halibut habitat, and he's also been doing these expansions over years to investigate how much halibut's outside of the typical surveyed areas, so we can expand into those areas. But yes, we're using the bottom area. I don't know any more details than that, and I think if you want to know more details than that, you may want to talk to Dr. Ray Webster himself.
Can I sneak in a follow-up?
Well, I think we still have 3 more folks on the line.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy.
Next up is Dan Falvey.
My first question is, what was Kathy's follow-up? I guess I have 2 comments and a question of my own. The first is I would agree with what Kathy was recommending about we look at incorporating other data sets into the stock distribution model. I mean, I think as a body, we've moved towards an ensemble of models to understand the abundance out there, and it seems like we'll be looking for multiple sources of information that could help us understand the stock distribution as well. As she said, the survey really is only out there for an area for a couple of weeks a year. The survey occurs over an 8-month season. We've got tag data from satellites that show that halibut actually, are found in multiple management areas in the course of the same season as they migrate to and from the spawning ground. So it seems like putting together a variety of sources to help us understand what this stock distribution really looks like would be a good step forward to trying to manage our biocomplexity. My second comment is, I noticed on your first slide that one of the main goals of the harvest policy was to minimize variability, either from year to year or not. And in my mind, apportionment and stock distribution is one of the leading factors in year-to-year variability. And so I'm not sure how you can decouple a harvest policy from the apportionment and stock distribution. I think they're linked together to achieve most of the management objectives that are outlined for the new harvest policy. And so in terms of stakeholder buy-in, I think if we come back a year from now and we've only addressed, the harvest policy and we actually haven't looked at managing variability by looking at some apportionment, you're not going to have the stakeholder buy-in that you would want, and we really would be disregarding our new harvest policy in the first year we have it out. And so my question is, if it is a sequential process that you have to follow, is there a way to manage the variability associated with stock distribution through an interim measure for a year or two until we actually have a solution to both that we can implement at the same time?
Hi, Dan. Well, the variability in catch is typically a trade-off with the amount of yield that you can take. And so there is always an underlying variability in any fisheries stock. And that variability just cannot be, you just have to accept that amount of variability. And one bit of variability we have to accept in halibut, it seems, that is changing size at age and variable recruitment, which seems correlated at least with the PDO. So we expect the abundance to go up and down even if we're not fishing. So then how does that translate into variability in catch? Well, if you have high catches that are also affecting that abundance, you're going to have more variable catches. So and that's why the MSAB is considering objectives and trying to evaluate the trade-offs between objectives. Because one trade-off between the yield, the amount of catch that you can take, and the variability in catch is to get a lower variability, you're probably going to have to lower the catch. So next year, if you want stable catches, my recommendation would be set low catches now, and you could set the same catch next year. Unfortunately, that's the trade-off. So we're out there to try and find what is the level of variability that stakeholders are willing to accept, and then can we define a harvest policy that meets that as well as the yields that you want to accept. And can we highlight any trade-offs that maybe you have to say, okay, we're going to give up a little variability for higher yield, for example.
And I agree it's a trade-off and it's a spectrum, how you manage variability. But there are two big drivers. One is intrinsic changes in the stock from year to year, and another is their distribution. And if you're not looking at ways to manage variability on both of those drivers, you're not going to achieve your objective. That's just the point.
And we're definitely working towards addressing apportionment and meeting those objectives through that part of the harvest policy. But as I said, I don't want to promise a whole lot in the next year and then not be able to deliver that. So if we can take smaller parts of the harvest policy and make improvements along the way, I think that's a much more efficient way and a way that we can actually make progress instead of being stuck thinking that we're going to do this sometime in the future and we never get there.
One other thing to add to that, Dan, where folks like yourself could be quite helpful is provide some advice as to what an acceptable amount of variability is. Right now, the MSAB has a draft objective to reduce or to limit catch variability to less than 50%, 15%, 1.5. Is that a reasonable number? Do we need a higher tolerance at the benefit of perhaps getting greater catches? Those trade-offs, as Alan described, are something that the MSAB can bring to the Commission to understand, but it'd be helpful to know if we have the right starting point. Is 15% the right place to start? So maybe a discussion item for conference board.
Thanks, Adam. The next question, Steve? Question person?
Yes, next up is Christopher.
Chris Spohr with Pacific Halibut Management Association. Looking at my list here, all the good questions have already been asked. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of things here. One is, it's been mentioned by Gary Williamson, brought it up, just bycatch. And we can do all this work, but unless we have a good estimate of what those mortalities are, it's all for naught. And so recently, we saw in the media that the work in the Gulf of Alaska on the trawl fishery has been postponed indefinitely by the council. Now, we've been taught by your new president not to trust what we read in the media. But I'd just like to comment on that in that, for years we've been trying to deal with this. We heard this program was going to get there. 2A has figured it out. 2B has figured it out. 2C, I don't know, you never seemed to have a problem to begin with. I don't know what happened there. But the point being is we need to, first of all, have a good estimate of those numbers, and we need to reduce that mortality. And if you look at the convention says in one section, Part D, that the Commission can be involved in stuff on incidental or halibut are harvested incidentally. And I'm not saying that we don't want the commission should be doing it on its own. I think what I'd say is the commission needs to look at working with the council collaboratively on this, so this can be addressed. Simply because it's the elephant in the room. The other points I want to make just quickly, 2 other points, just kind of interesting here on the discussion and the points raised on the current harvest policy in eBio. It's kind of rocked the world in terms of, you know, if you look at the book, there's a lot of stuff about the blue line, and eBio's kind of pops up everywhere, and so it's kind of making for some interesting reading now. But I just think we all have to take that into account as we're having discussions on at our upcoming discussions. The last point I'd make, though, is, Doug Maven alluded to it yesterday, and Dr. Martell alluded to in his question talking about surplus production. And I'm just wondering, when we're looking at coastwide fishing intensity, are we running the same risk? Like, say, for example, you had one area where the intensity was, for lack of a better word, too high, and in the other area, it's too low. And so, you know, our head's in the oven, our feet's in the freezer, but on average, we're comfortable. So my point being is, you know, by having fishing intensity too high in an area, we could be inadvertently damaging the stock, and we don't know about it until 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever years down the road. So I know we've talked about coastwide versus area versus, you know, I just think that's something we need to keep in our minds here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris.
And next up is Jim Lane. Okay, question's been covered, says Jim. Then next is Ken Wing.
I too happen to agree that Ian is a pretty smart guy. And I could see exactly what you said of how he's been preparing us for this day, and I think if you notice, and what's been going on for the last number of years around, is everybody's concerned about getting the amount of fish that's in their area at the right number. And I think that, like the blue line being gone, we've never seen it again. I think the word apportionment, that should be gone too, because it's really stock distribution. And unless you get the stock distribution, how much fish is in that area right, you will never get the buy-in of the stakeholders. And all of us are fishermen. And you're going to have a hard time to convince any one of us that when we go and set our gear and we get a high rate of catch per unit effort, that there's not fish there. And if we get a low rate, there's nothing there. And if it doesn't correlate with what the survey is doing, something is wrong with the survey. And I think that there's been some comments over the last few days, and particularly you see it in out of 2A, 2C, those places where they're looking at the inlets, you know, out off the edge, those types of things. And they know where the fish are. So do we. We got a lot of inlets in our 2B too. And when it gets to, like, what's an acceptable amount of variability, well, in 2B, we continually try to tighten our variability down towards zero. And we do, and we've done that. You know, it's kind of just something that's evolved from a process that there was actually a crisis. We weren't going to fish unless we did something.
Thanks, Ken. Do you have a question?
Yeah. No, the question is coming.
Yeah, but if you could get to the question, that would be helpful.
Okay. So the real question is, at the end of the day, is not one group is going to do it by themselves. They can't. It's impossible. The Amendment 80 fleet can't do it. The 2B group can't do it. The 2C group can't do it. It's how do you get everybody to buy into the process?
Thanks, Ken. Bob, I think you had a question or a comment.
Yeah. Question and comment to Alan. I'm looking at slide 25, Alan, and so that's the one that shows us status quo SPR in a blue line. And under the status quo SPR, we've force-fit what we've actually approved in terms of harvest level of 41.6 million pounds in that. And for the last, I think since 13, we've been running, if you backtrack an SPR, it says here 2018 is 68% probability that you're going to have less than this year. And I just am wondering that in these area we presume that it's apportionment that we're having a problem with, and it may well be in part that, but there seems to be also an underlying assumption that the extrapolation from the surveys to what's out there is absolutely correct. And I'm just wondering, are we really that lucky to operate at a 68% probability over 4 years and have the resource rebounding in area 2B, 2C, 5 of the 6 areas in 3A have rebounded other than Chillicothe, and for 2 years the survey has shown ups in every one of the areas, I think in 3B, and yet our spawning biomass has dropped this year. I'm just wondering if, you know, the pie shouldn't be larger also, isn't part of the extrapolating problem. And there's a lot, this is a three-dimensional chess issue, and I don't think you can assume any level is necessarily accurate. And so it's an observation, and if we're at 68% probability over a 4-year period of time, it starts to suggest to me that maybe the base assumption might be in part not be true as well. That that base assumption is from the survey data to what we think is spawning biomass. So if you have a comment on that, I'd appreciate it. But I think there's a new question in my mind anyway, that the big problem out there may not be solely just apportionment.
So was you going to answer that question, Alan? Or
yeah, I can just agree with you that there are many dimensions of uncertainty in this problem, and I'll let the person more familiar with the assessment answer the question.
I'll second that. The importance of uncertainty in these calculations can't be underscored. I spent a lot of time yesterday describing the uncertainty in our absolute stock size. And much of that uncertainty comes from things like we don't know exactly how the survey represents the population. And that's why we have such a broad range in current biomass estimates from around 170 million pounds all the way up to 270 to 280. With regards to the probability in the table, this table gets updated every year. And actually, if you look back to last year and the year before, the probabilities of stock decline at the adopted catch levels last year and the year before were actually much less than 68. And so what's important about that is that the data are updating our understanding of the stock dynamics each year. If you go all the way back to 2013, the first year we created the decision table, there was a very high probability of stock decline at the levels that, catch levels that were actually set in that year. And a big part of that was that we had just come from a long period of stock decline, and we had very little data to tell us anything other than, well, more decline is likely. With a couple more years of data, last year and the year before, we saw more optimistic probabilities in the table, reflecting our current understanding and the current data. And then this year, you see the risk has increased again slightly. And that's partly, as I mentioned yesterday, a function of estimated relatively low recruitment in the last few years that's going to be moving into the stock over the near future. as well as slightly less optimistic results in this year's data than we projected from last year. So these probabilities get updated every year, and they just represent our best estimate of the stock trend.
Thanks, Ian. I think we have one more person has a question.
Yes, we do. Blake Tipton.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Blake Tipton, President of the Hanna Halibut Association North America. You asked yesterday as to where our reception is going to be at the Union Club. It's on Gordon Street. It's open to all participants of the meetings, including their relatives, spouses, and partners, and including our buddy Jerry Christensen. Now, if I could just switch hats for a second here. I have a question for Dr. Stewart. As a buyer of halibut for the better part of 3 decades going on now. And I looked at the blue line in the book, and I can't get my head around why in 2016 Area 2B dropped from 5.2 to 4.7, and I've had a number of people try to explain it to me to no avail with my thick head. So perhaps, you know, it's been 5 years, time goes by when you're having fun, but why has Area 2B gone down on the blue line to 4.7 when the biomass, you said, or the spawning biomass has only gone about 2%, because that gives us a 10% discount or a 10% reduction.
Thank you for the question, Blake. You've identified the two components that are contributing to that. The first being the change in the stock assessment. So this year's stock assessment is slightly lower than last year, and that's a component in a downward change across all areas. The second piece is the major improvement the Halibut Commission has made this year in their survey modeling. So you heard from Ray yesterday. We've not taken that undertaking lightly. We reviewed that with our scientific review board both in June and again in this fall. It's a fairly major change in our understanding of how the biomass is distributed around the stock, and it reflects a major improvement over our previous methods. The result of that change, however, as I showed in a couple of the graphs yesterday, is that we're now estimating slightly less biomass on an absolute scale to be occurring in Area 2 relative to the core of the stock. Are we uncertain about those estimates? Absolutely. And we now have a tool that we can express that uncertainty as well. In fact, although I agree, it appears to be a major change when you focus on the difference in a particular area. Overall, that difference between last year and this year is within the range of uncertainty that we have coming from those estimates. But I do definitely want to underscore the improvement that we've made in the survey analysis this year, and the fact that it has had a distinct effect on our understanding of the distribution of the stock.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Could I just make one further comment? Is that possible?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I won't take long, I promise, however I could. It's come to my attention that there are a number of people since the inception of the blue line are concerned that Area 2B consistently has been over the blue line by as much as 2 million pounds. Okay, since 2012, when the blue line, I think, is when the year it came in, 5 years ago, we have averaged 7 million pounds a year in Area 2B as a harvest, including our sports sector. They're exorbitant 15%. In that 5 years, we have done no damage to the resource. As a matter of fact, our survey results have been consistently going up for 5 years. Our weight per unit effort has been consistently going up for 5 years. Our catch per unit effort has been consistently increasing for 5 years, and yet where our fleets are fishing with one hand tied behind their backs because of rockfish protection areas, sponge reef protection areas, marine parks, and the unjustified 30% cut in our yelloweye quota in 2016, which nobody can really get into my head why it should have gone down, because I've been buying fish for 30 years and I get pretty good stats on what I get out of my feeder boats. So I'd like to assure all of our American friends that we are not the hoarders of the halibut. As a matter of fact, in Area 2C, you have a similar trend in your stocks. And now we saw from the slide yesterday that there's possibility of halibut going down as far as San Francisco and surveys going down that far. So we've been conserving fish for the last 26 years with the beginning of the IVQ, In 2006, we came into a management scheme where we were very restricted, had to have quota for everything and 100% observer coverage on everything that floats in the groundfish industry. And our guys are fishing with one hand behind their back and the possibility of a few figures going behind their back in 2017. We are doing our best to be the best corporate and citizens that we can in this industry. But, we've never agreed with apportionment. We probably never will, but I understand our powers to be are trying to do something about it and coming up with a new thing. And you've done a marvelous job, Ian. Don't get me wrong, but I've got a vent. But, perhaps we might look at going back to a closed area assessment for Area 2 because there's one management area. And it is different, and it's been admitted that Area 2 is an anomaly in relation to the rest of the coastwide. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Blake. So I've let us go over a bit on time as far as this particular agenda item, and I appreciate all the questions that came from the audience to clarify various aspects. We're going to break and get back together at 10 after 11, and we'll be going through the regulatory proposals, starting with the IPHC ones from Jamie. You good to go? Oh, we have a dog in the room. All right, Jamie, if you would, you're going to lead off with the IPHC regulatory proposals?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Hope everyone got some caffeine and stretched their legs and are ready for a tour of our 2017 regulatory proposals. This is agenda item 7. The paper associated with this is paper 10. You'll notice there that it says Rev 1. It's a revised paper, so make sure you're looking at the right version. And also associated with this are proposals A through P. So a quick overview of the process for regulatory proposals. Each fall, IPHC solicits regulatory proposals from IPHC staff, agencies, and stakeholders. At the interim meeting, commissioners review the proposals. And at the annual meeting, commissioners review and decide which ones to approve. So that's what we're going to do here later in the week on Friday. I also noted there to the right in the little letter that regulatory proposals are due by October 31st each year. And then also don't confuse the regulatory proposals with the catch limit proposals. Submission for those are accepted between the interim meeting and December 31st each year. And those will be discussed separately under a different agenda item later in the week on Thursday. Under agenda item 7.4, they're listed in proposal Q. So we have 2 IPHC staff regulatory proposals, 1 from the National Marine Fisheries Service and 13 from stakeholders. And I've listed there where on our website you can find all of these regulatory proposals. I'll start off with our first IPHC staff regulatory proposal. This is proposal A. It's the head-on landed weight requirement. This would apply to the commercial fishery coast-wide. I'll note that Area 2A already requires the head-on. The purpose of this is to improve the estimate of total removals. We found in a study in 2013 there was variance in where the heads were cut among regions and ports, and it was ranging from 9 to 18%, with an average around 13%. Head-off halibut, this may cause a 2 to 3% underestimate of total removals. And while landing records show around 70% of halibut are reported in the head-off condition, what we've heard is that most fish are actually delivered to the processor with the head attached, and then the head is later removed at the processing plant. The conversions applied within the landing record system would remain the same, so it's what is currently done, which is 10% for the heads and 2% for the ice and slime, which is considered unwashed fish. Associated with this proposal is a proposal to remove the 24-inch head-off minimum size limit, and that piece of the proposal comes with some distinct issues that are listed in more detail in our Proposal A paper. And here's an example of what happens when there's this variance of cutting the head from between 9% and 18%. And I'll note this is also on our display outside. And I believe there's some handouts that go with this as well. But starting on the left-hand side, this would be if it was a head-on proposal. So the landed weight would come in at 10,000 pounds, that's dressed and washed. It would be weighed and reported as a head-on fish on the fish ticket. The landing receipt would then do the automatic 10% deduction, and what would get reported is the net weight in pounds of 9,000 pounds. So the two examples on the right-hand side are head-off fish. So again, the fish is coming off the boat head-on, and it's at 10,000 pounds. Then it's headed by the plant and weighed and reported in the head-off condition. So if it was, the head was 9% of the weight, and you can see it's a smaller head cut there, the pounds would come in at 9,100 pounds reported on the fish ticket. And if it was cut with a bigger head, it would come in at 8,200 pounds, and that would be an underestimate of what the actual weight would have been. How widespread is this concern? As I mentioned, head-off coming in the fish ticket system, it's showing 71% of fish are landed in the head-off condition. But what we've heard is that most fishermen actually deliver their fish to the processor with the head on, and the heads are being removed at the processing plant. And again, this may cause a 2 to 3% underestimate of total removals. Moving on to our second IPHC staff proposal, Proposal B. This is to remove the IPHC closed area, which we've heard some about already today. This would affect the commercial fishery in Alaska. The purpose is that there's no scientific basis for retaining the closed area in its current form, whereby only the directed fishery is prohibited from fishing within the area. I wanted to note that there's no new fish created with this proposal. Area 4 CDE catch limits already include halibut from that closed area. And I want to call your attention to a paper that the Commission staff produced on Friday. So it's a new paper that's available on our website. It's called Info 3, so Info Paper 3, and it provides additional background information on this proposal, and it answers a lot of the questions that the commissioners and some stakeholders have brought up at our interim meeting. I'll go over the summary of that paper. It's going to go over past considerations, the history of boundaries, nursery grounds, other nearby closed areas, bycatch, and impacts of allowing directed halibut fishing. So some of the past considerations for this closed area removal. IPHC has closed areas to protect halibut nursery grounds and subsequently reopened them. So 2 areas were closed in 1932 in Canadian and Southeast Alaskan waters, and they were reopened in 1960 after surveys showed older and larger fish were in the area. So we have some precedent for reopening closed areas. For the IPHC closed area in the Bering Sea, it was created in 1967 to protect juvenile halibut from foreign fishing. And it worked in the late 1960s and 70s, and bycatch was reduced. However, in the 1980s, it was no longer serving its intended purpose after foreign fishing fleets were excluded, and U.S. vessels were again allowed to fish in the closed area, except for the directed commercial fishery. It was reduced in size in 1990 because surveys suggested that relatively few juveniles were caught with long lines. And I'll go into that in a little more detail later. Other past considerations, after the closed area was reduced in 1990, the Commission requested a review of the closed area, and that's in Trumbull's paper 1998, and that full paper is included in this info paper on our website. To summarize, the paper states that the closed area does not reduce halibut bycatch mortality, it provides little biological benefit to the halibut resource, and it does not protect nursery grounds because fisheries that catch juvenile halibut are fishing in the area. In addition, the paper refers to the closed area as a possible buffer for uncertainty in the stock assessment and management of halibut. However, uncertainty has been greatly reduced since 1998. So most recently, the Commission considered removing this closed area between 2011 and 2013. They discussed it at the IPHC's 2011 interim meeting and 2012 annual meeting. There was a letter sent to the North Pacific Council, a response sent to IPHC. It was again discussed at the IPHC's 2012 interim meeting and 2013 annual meeting. And finally, the commissioners did not approve the proposal, noting that following some discussion, the Commission decided that although this may be considered in the future, Opening this area is not a high priority at this time. And all of those documents are included in the appendices of that info paper. Turning now to the history of the boundaries. Before 1967, it was considered Area 4E, and there's a map of that also in that info paper 3. When it was created in 1967, and that's the map to the left showing that it includes the Bristol Bay area. And then it was reduced in size in 1990, and that's the map on the right. Turning now to the nursery ground. There's no scientific basis that the closed area is a nursery ground of any significance relative to any other grounds for Pacific halibut. And I wanted to touch on Jerry's comment earlier. There's a nuance here in that we're not saying that this isn't a nursery ground. It's just that it's not different than any of the other nursery grounds that we have for halibut. And further, in the papers that are listed in the info paper, there's a whole bunch of citations on what we found on nursery grounds. We're seeing that the young halibut exists throughout the range from the Bering Sea to at least as far south as British Columbia. Oh, I wanted to note a couple other things on nursery grounds that's in our info paper 3. We were just noting that nursery ground is defined broadly. As juvenile fish or invertebrate species grow in higher densities, avoid predation more successfully, or grow faster there than in different habitat. And we note that the IPHC does not have a consistent definition of nursery grounds. So I think there's further work to be done there. And then we also note the age and length range definitions that we've used to consider what juvenile halibut are and nursery grounds are less than 65 centimeter fork length, halibut through age 1, and halibut through age 2. But I note that there's further work to be done there. The fourth thing we looked at were other nearby closed areas. There are at least 11 closed areas that are near or within the IPHC closed area for other non-halibut fisheries. And there are maps provided of all of those in that info paper 3. For bycatch, there are several fisheries that operate in the closed area, including groundfish trawl, that's bottom and pelagic trawl, groundfish hook and line, and commercial groundfish pot gear. Most of these fisheries catch halibut, both adults and juveniles, as bycatch. Half of the bycatch in Area 4 CDE was from the closed area from these fisheries, and almost all of the bycatch is under 32 inches. Turning now to the impacts of allowing a directed halibut fishery in this area. Again, a reminder that there's no new fish created to the directed fishery. The halibut stock in the closed area already is included in the stock assessment, which treats areas 4, C, D, and E and the closed area as a single unit. The overall harvest device for area 4 CDE also includes the closed area, so there's no change in total catch available to the directed fishery by opening this area. Also, based on survey results, fishing in this area will likely encounter similar numbers and sizes of halibut as are found in the rest of area 4 CD and E with comparable ocean and bottom characteristics. And I'll note that in 2015 our survey actually went into the closed area and we found that around 30% of the catch was U32 fish, which could be considered a proxy for juvenile halibut. The primary impact of this change on the directed fishery revolves around who from area 4 CDE would be permitted to fish in this area if it were opened, and that's a matter for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. There's an example here provided on your screen of what it would look like to open up this area. This example shows that there's no change in the bottom area from the current closure to opening it up as proposed. There's no change in the O32 that we would see from survey. There's no change to the apportionment proportion. There's no change to what would be the blue line catch limit recommendation. What would change, and it's noted there on the right, is where the commercial fishery could fish. So that all that light blue area would be available to the directed commercial fishery for halibut. And this example is provided out on our display as well. So in summary, there's no scientific basis for the closed area. There's no new fish created by opening up the closed area.
Data shows minimal bycatch of juvenile halibut is expected from directed halibut longline fishery compared to other fisheries in the closed area. There's no longer a need to maintain this area as a buffer for uncertainty, and the North Pacific Fishery Management Council would need to consider which Area 4 CDE commercial halibut fishermen can fish in the area. Turning now to agency proposals, we received one from the National Marine Fisheries Service. This is on fishing in multiple regulatory areas. It would affect commercial fishermen in Alaska, and it would harmonize our IPHC regulations with the NMFS regulations. So essentially our IPHC regulations would just refer directly to the NMFS regulations. And there's more detail in Proposal C on our website. Turning now to stakeholder proposals, I'll step through each of these. We start with Proposal D, which is to upgrade the U.S.-Canada Treaty. This one, if I recall, would have a commissioner for each regulatory area. So there would be one commissioner from Canada and the rest would be U.S. commissioners. The IPHC staff recommendation is to refer to the second performance review for this proposal. That would be agenda item 10.7 and paper 18. For Proposal E, it's to drop the blue line. I think we've heard quite a lot about this already. It's not appropriate as a regulatory proposal, but it has been discussed under agenda item 5 and also earlier today. For Proposal F, to drop the IPHC setline survey, IPHC staff would recommend disapproving. For Proposal G, the closure of the nursery area, this would be to close all fisheries from the nursery area. So this would be opposite of what IPHC staff is proposing. And we will defer this one to the council. Or we recommend we defer this one to the council. For Proposal H and Proposal I are very similar. They would ask that guided and unguided sport fisheries in Alaska have similar regulations and be held to similar standards. We will defer those to the council. We recommend deferring those to the council. Proposal J and K are also similar in that they deal with sport fisheries in Alaska. Proposal J is the elimination of the law requiring skin to be left on halibut. I wanted to clarify this one that currently under regulations you have to leave a patch of skin to show that you've got 2 fillets from the dark side and 2 fillets from the white side of the halibut. And the patch that can be left remaining can be small. My understanding is it's just enough that enforcement can tell it's coming from the dark side of the halibut or the light side of the halibut. IPHC staff recommends disapproving this proposal. For Proposal K, to allow filleted halibut in the sport fishery, again, I'll note that you can fillet halibut in the sport fishery now. It can be 2 fillets from the dark side and 2 from the light side. My understanding of this proposal is they're looking at further chunking up the halibut. IPHC would recommend disapproving this proposal as it would be difficult to enforce limits. Proposal L, M, and N are similar. They're for the 3A charter fisheries. These proposals were discussed at the North Pacific Fishery Management Council in their halibut committee during the December meeting. IPHC recommends deferring those to the council. Proposal O is to clarify pot gear requirements. Let me get my documents on this one. There's 2 parts to this proposal, as noted at the top of Proposal O. The first part is to clarify if halibut may be targeted with pots in federal waters and state waters. So IPHC staff would recommend deferring Part 1 to NMFS, but I will note in conversations with NMFS, my understanding is that if you're participating in the sablefish IFQ fishery and that fishery is allowed in state waters, then you can also be fishing with pot gear in state waters where that sablefish IFQ fishery is allowed. And NMFS is available if the commissioners have further questions on that piece. For Part 2 of the question for Proposal O is to delete the prohibition against carrying Dungeness crab pots on a vessel while commercially fishing for or in possession of halibut in IPHC Regulation 19.3. IPHC staff is going to recommend disapproving Part 2 at this time. For the size limit clarification, Proposal P, if Proposal A from IPHC staff is not approved, we recommend considering approval of this Proposal P. What Proposal P recommends is that halibut not be measured twice. So it's either measured in the head-on condition or the head-off condition, but don't measure the same fish twice and measure it in the condition it's delivered in. For the catch limit proposals, those will be discussed on Thursday under Agenda Item 7.4. They're listed on our website under Proposal Q. There's some additional proposals you'll hear about this week, so I just wanted to flag them for everybody. Fishing season dates will be come from the advisory bodies. The Area 2A directed commercial fishery potential opening dates will come from agency reports. The domestic government catch sharing plans will come from agency reports, so that's from both Canada and the U.S. And Area 2C and 3A charter management measures will come from agency reports. And commissioners will entertain all of that on Friday. I'm not going to go through the recommendations here. They're listed in Paper 10, Rev 1, and the commissioners will discuss this on Friday. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Jamie, for putting that presentation together to give us an overview of all of the 13, I think there are regulatory proposals for consideration this year. I see there's a couple folks here, Bob and Linda.
So Jamie, I have a question on 2 of these. There's a staff proposal to have the legal size or the fish delivered and weighed head on. And then there's also from the public, the one that would have you only measure one fish once. If it was delivered head off, it would be 24 inches. If it was head on, then it's 32 inches. And so if we were to go with the staff recommendation, does that resolve the issue, the other issue of, I'm thinking, does that, if a mutilated fish is delivered and its head's not there, do we still need a pectoral fin to the tail size limit?
So I believe you're referring to our IPHC staff Proposal A on the head-on requirement, which would also remove the 24-inch minimum head-off size requirement, as well as Proposal P from commercial fishermen on the size limit clarification. If Proposal A is adopted by the commissioners and includes that removing that 24-inch minimum head-off size requirement, there would be no need for Proposal P. If the commissioners don't approve Proposal A, then IPHC staff would recommend the commissioners consider Proposal P, which would require only one measurement, and it would come in the condition the fish is landed. So if the fish is landed head-on, it's measured head-on. If the fish is landed head-off, it's measured head-off for the minimum size.
And then, this, Mr. Chairman, the second question I have is on this Dungeness pot issue. I didn't realize that we had this as a reg. I thought this was, is this because we are mirroring something with the state of Alaska, or is that why I thought I heard some hesitancy in your voice on how to handle this? Or what's the genesis of our regulation here on sports gear on a commercial vessel?
So my hesitancy was that there are a lot of nuances to the different parts of this regulatory proposal, Proposal A. We've already had a lot of discussions, I know, between stakeholders and NIMS and enforcement and general counsel here at this meeting. To clarify for the second part of the proposal, which refers to the IPHC regulations on this proposal, in Section 19, Paragraph 3, no person shall possess halibut while on board a vessel carrying any trawl nets or fishing pots capable of catching halibut. And that's the question with the Dungeness crab and shrimp pots. Are they fishing gear capable of catching halibut? And if so, under IPHC regulations, they would be prohibited.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead, Linda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question was answered by Bob's first question, but I did want to follow up on his second question. So the concern of the staff would be addressed provided the pot was not capable of catching halibut. Is that correct?
That's correct. I would also remind the commissioners that I believe when the sablefish pot requirement was adopted through the commission, there was a 3-year review that was going to happen on halibut or pots that are capable of catching halibut and looking at pot gear and halibut. So that's part of the hesitancy, is making sure that we've fully considered, if we're going to start considering pots that are capable of catching halibut and listing them out, just making sure we've thought through that. Does that answer your question?
Jim?
Yes, thank you. So, Jamie, on the Bering Sea nursery ground, I have kind of two questions, I guess. One is, this is a staff recommendation, so does the staff see some insult to the halibut resource if it is not fished in that area by the directed fishermen? And secondly, has there been a request or multiple requests by the fishermen in 4A to have that opened?
Thank you for your question, Jim. I have not personally heard from stakeholders about that. As far as the first part of your question on whether there would be any, if I understood it correctly, harm in not allowing fishermen in there, I think everything would remain status quo. What IPHC staff is suggesting is there would be no harm either by letting them in there, from the IPHC's perspective.
Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners for Jamie? Do we have any in the room, Steve?
I see one hand raised, so we'll go with that. We don't have a list yet. For
oh, okay.
Yep. I did sign up on the list back.
Okay. I think so.
Okay. I just want to mention one thing about the pot situation. I hope that you'll consider changing that regulation, because when we're out there fishing, we get tangled up with some lost gear once in a while, and they're big crab pots, and we like to bring them into town and get them off the grounds because they're condemned gear. And now we can't do that because we can't have a pot aboard that could catch a halibut. So, I mean, we're not going to mess with pot fishing when we're longline fishing, but I just think that was kind of a ridiculous deal there, and it prevents us from getting the grounds cleaned up when we catch these pots. And we catch quite a few over the years. So I just like to have that considered. And I want to talk a little bit about this closed area. The reason I looked at this is I was looking through the treaty. And in the treaty in 1932, we were down to 21 million commercial catch rate on halibut. So they decided that they'd put this closed area in, and they closed that area up to all fishing. And in the result, it took 25 years, and we were harvesting 71 million pounds of fish. So I don't know how much that contributed to that closure of the grounds, but I thought that was pretty important. I want to talk about one other proposal here. I think the set line survey I was talking about is that I'd like to see more use on that set line survey of our observed trips, because our observed trips, I think that helps a lot, and that's what I put in this proposal. I think that's pretty important. I know we need the survey, but maybe in the future, if we're all cambered one day, we might not need it quite as often to save money for the fisheries and save the lives of a few million halibut that we're killing there to run the program. But other than that, I think the blue line looks like we're working on that, and doesn't sound like anybody's interested in 7 more commissioners on the U.S. side. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and I'd actually like to respond to your clarification on dropping the IPHC set line survey. We do include information from observed halibut trips and from commercial logbooks and the data that we use here at the Commission. So, but I appreciate that you clarified that we may not need the IPHC survey as much.
Okay, thank you.
Are there, yeah, I'm just going to confirm, thanks Jake. Are there any other questions for Jamie on the regulatory proposals? All right, I'm not seeing any. So I think that's all that we have on our agenda right now, right? And is there anything else that the commissioners want to bring up at this time? We do have a bit of time. So not seeing anything, we're going to adjourn this session. I think conference board is in here an hour and a half. It takes Steve an hour and a half to set up the room for conference board. And we as a commission are meeting back down in the harbor room. Is it at 1:30 or 1? I think right now the agenda says 1:30. But we do have some time where people are comfortable starting at 1, starting sooner. Yeah, so the Commission is going to meet in the Harbor Room starting at 1 o'clock, and Conference Board meets in this room here, and it takes an hour and a half to start to set up the room for this. All right, with that we're adjourned. Thanks.
Well done.